Hey guys, Trey here with another forecasting video for today's severe weather threat across the northern plains. Here's the SPC outlook. We have an enhanced risk for parts of eastern North Dakota, northern and central South Dakota, surrounded by a slight risk that extends into Minnesota, and then a marginal risk outside of that. We also have a slight risk down here for the Gulf Coast due to Tropical Storm Cristobal, but we will not be focusing on that this morning. We're going to look at mainly this enhanced risk. We have a threat for strong tornadoes today, 10% hatched area for eastern North Dakota, northeast South Dakota into extreme western and northwestern Minnesota. Also have a wind threat, significant wind threat, and a significant hail threat as well. So let's get started. We'll look at the satellite first, as we normally do. You can see Tropical Storm Cristobal spinning down there. Beautiful satellite representation there down along the Gulf Coast. It's going to make landfall sometime today. It produced quite a few tornadoes in Florida yesterday, and its very outer reaches there. Should see more of the same today, I would suspect, across the Gulf Coast states with that. And as that moves northward the next couple days, we may see a tornado threat develop as well across the Midwest. But as far as our area goes, it's pretty darn clear this morning through most of the area. We do have some, looks like what appear to be warm advection showers across eastern South Dakota. We can go ahead and zoom in here and take a look at those more closely. And yeah, we see this looks like kind of warm advection stuff to me, which is a good sign. That means moisture is streaming northward into the target area for today. Some stable low clouds up here in North Dakota as well, but those shouldn't be an issue. And we do have some pretty significant thunderstorm complex here in northern Minnesota that is ongoing as well. So that's a good sign. Moisture is streaming into the region. And if we go to our surface map here, we'll refresh so we have the most recent. This is about 10 minutes ago as of this recording. We can zoom in and see we have a very pretty surface map here if we're looking for severe weather. We have 20 to 25 knot southeasterlies at the surface here, that's going to pump in this moisture here. We see 70s dew points here in eastern South Dakota, a little bit less out here to the west. But I believe this moisture here in eastern South Dakota is going to continue to stream northward throughout the day. And actually, we can take a closer look at the surface map by looking at the mesonet from South Dakota State here, and we also have a North Dakota mesonet, so we can get a better, higher resolution picture of what we're seeing on that surface map. This is the South Dakota State mesonet, and we have dew point pulled up right now. We see we have a nice collection of 70s dew points out here through much of the southeast quadrant of South Dakota. 73 out here for these few stations here. This would be about Brookings, just north of Sioux Falls. Sioux Falls area, about 70 to 72 degree dew points. That should continue again to stream northward throughout the day into North Dakota. Let's take a look at our North Dakota mesonet. Here is our current map. Let's go ahead and look at dew point as well. Very moist air mass again creeping into southeast North Dakota. We have a 73 dew point there at that station, which is Edgeley. Let's go back to our map here. So point is, we have pretty good moisture all across the region here today. That should continue to shift northward as the day progresses on that sort of warm advection, the strong surface winds. Let's look at our station plots here. Again, strong winds, 15 to 20 knots out here through much of eastern South Dakota, or eastern North Dakota, excuse me. That should help pump that moisture northward throughout the day. Let's take a look at our surface pattern and our upper air pattern here. This is our SPC mesoanalysis map of the current surface plot. We see we have a pretty well-defined surface low up in just across the border into Canada from northeast Montana there, with a reflection that extends all the way down into the southern Rockies there. Very broad sort of cyclonic flow here at the surface with a couple of different centers, it looks like, with the strongest being there just north of the Montana-Canada border. Then, of course, Cristobal down there, very tight very broad, but a very well-defined circulation down there just off the coast of Louisiana. Should make landfall again sometime today. 500 millibars, let's see our upper air pattern. We have broad southwesterly flow with this trough that's centered somewhere off the Pacific Northwest. That should continue throughout the day and throughout the next couple of days as well. So we may have severe weather opportunities here in the northern plains continuing over the next couple of days. But as we go on throughout the day, this should again maintain itself. 40 to 50 knots here aloft is just kind of the sweet spot for severe weather. For kind of your classic days have seen a lot of 500 millibar patterns like that. Very, very, very strong low-level jet here at 850. We see a 50 to 60 knot low-level jet here across as far down as northwest Kansas, extending all the way up into eastern South Dakota, southeast North Dakota, into Minnesota. So that is very favorable for severe weather, and that continues to be the case. It does appear to weaken according to this RAT mesoanalysis model throughout the day, but that is still more than adequate for supercell. A supercell wind profile. 700 millibars. Let's see if we can detect any short waves. I see one. Looks like maybe one there, just north of the North Dakota-Canada border, extending from that center of that low, that surface low we saw extends all the way up here, and we can see a reflection of that at 700 millibars. Shortwave potentially back here down into Colorado, or Wyoming, and down into Colorado, northeast New Mexico. But it's fairly subtle out here for us in this target region of the Dakotas. So it looks like forcing will be subtle today, although we do have what appears to be a very favorable supercell wind profile. Short waves are going to be subtle today, so that makes me think storm coverage may be a little bit less than what the cams are showing, which we'll take a look at in a second, the convective allowing models. And if let's look at the soundings now, and this is the Aberdeen, South Dakota sounding, so northeast South Dakota, and pretty much a loaded gun right here. There's 75 over 70 at the surface, very, very moist air mass at the surface. Little bit of drying as you go just off the surface, not quite a deep, classic moist layer by definition, I would say, but definitely more than adequate, I think, here. You don't really have significant drying here off the surface, so this is a pretty good sounding. A little bit of a surface inversion there, just off the surface. So we are capped here. That's going to hold convection off through much of the day. As we saw on satellite, we are fairly sunny up here. This is Aberdeen right in this location, so we should get at worst filtered sunshine that should erode that cap throughout the day. But take a look at this hodograph. This hodograph is nuts right here. Lots of turning in the low levels. Not much of a hodograph aloft, but this hodograph is definitely indicative of a parameter space in which we would see strong tornadoes. We already have 2,000 joules per kilogram mixed layer CAPE. And that is forecast to get significantly greater throughout the day, approaching 4,000 to 5,000 joules per kilogram. So if we can get anything close to this hodograph as the day progresses, definitely need to watch out if you're in South Dakota into North Dakota. That is a parameter space we don't see very often up here, but when we do, it's usually indicative of big tornadoes. Also, large hail should be a threat. We see some semblance of maybe an elevated mixed layer up here between 7 and 500 millibars. Very steep lapse rates aloft, approaching 8 degrees Celsius per kilometer. So any storms that form, at least especially in the first couple hours of formation, should have a large hail threat as well. And we do have strong winds aloft that will be transported down to the surface through downdrafts. So a damaging wind threat definitely in play today as well. Let's look at the... We don't have one in eastern North Dakota. Let's look at Minneapolis-St. Paul. It's a little bit farther east, but still potentially representative of the environment. Very significant inversion here at the surface, and much more meager moisture out here. 65 over 57 out here in Minneapolis-St. Paul, but again, a very, very favorable hodograph. Lots of turning in the lowest 3 kilometers or so. So wind profile is definitely indicative of severe storms today and supercells with a tornado threat if they can maintain this wind profile throughout the day, which I don't see why they wouldn't. This pattern is not stagnant, but it's not going to be one that rapidly changes much throughout the day. And on this Minneapolis-St. Paul sounding, you see that elevated mixed layer there, even more well-defined here, 8.6 degrees Celsius per kilometer lapse rate in that region. So large hail definitely a possibility with large cape, large instability, steep lapse rates aloft. Definitely could see some significant hail reports coming out of North Dakota, South Dakota, and western Minnesota today. Let's take a look at the cams here, or not the cams, we'll look at the NAM first. This is the 12Z NAM, hot off the press, just coming in. So here's our trough, 500 millibar trough, definitely a broad area of southwesterly flow aloft. And here's our trough from yesterday that produced that derecho across the northern plains yesterday. That has moved off into Canada, and we have just a broad fetch of southwesterly flow aloft behind that, and that continues to be the case throughout the day. Again, forcing, I don't see any well-defined short waves in here. It's going to be subtle forcing, which will be a good thing as far as storm coverage goes. If you're chasing today, I think a discrete storm mode would be favored here for a couple hours. Let's go ahead and zoom in at 700 millibars. We'll go to the Central Plains sector, see if we have any short waves inbound. I maybe see one right in there. This is 18Z today. Maybe one right in there. There's a broad belt of southwesterly 700s. There's one here's a little representation of one here at 0Z. That may be convectively enhanced. It likely is convectively enhanced. Let's go to our Northern Plains sector to see if we see anything. And just not much in the way of well-defined short waves. It's going to be subtle today. So with subtle forcing, that usually means discrete storms. We'll take a look at the cams in a second. Again, they're showing a pretty quick transition to a linear mode, but I think the discrete mode will be a little bit longer than what the cams are showing, just based on the lack of significant forcing. I would expect discrete storms to be the favored mode, at least for the first few hours today. Here's our low-level jet. That, again, it remains pretty strong throughout the day. 40 to 50 knots out here over a broad fetch from eastern North Dakota down into South Dakota and into Minnesota. That is definitely favorable for severe weather. Due southerly 850s. That is a pretty map you want to see if you're chasing storms. Beautiful 850s today. We'll look at the surface map as well. We see that significant low pressure area just north of the Montana-Canada border. We see kind of our axis of heating here extending up into that across eastern South Dakota into North Dakota. And we do get temperatures to warm significantly throughout the day. Would expect that based on our satellite presentation. Not a lot of cloudiness to talk about here in the Dakotas. We get temperatures to warm into the upper 80s. So with upper 60s and low 70s dew points hanging around, our temperature dew point spread should be well within the range for tornadic supercells today. Looking at something like 87, 88 over 68 to 73 dew points. That is definitely in the range for tornadic supercells, especially in the northern plains here. The dew point, we do get that moisture to hang around throughout the day. A little bit higher dew point into North Dakota. So spreads up here are going to be a little bit more favorable for tornadoes, but down here they should be favorable as well. They'll be kind of right on the cusp of that kind of 20-degree temperature dew point spread. That is kind of the rule of thumb as far as the limit for tornadic activity goes. But definitely, I think a tornado threat will exist down in South Dakota. I think maybe you might have a slightly more favorable environment up in North Dakota, eastern North Dakota, especially where that low-level jet sticks around. So somewhere in the southeastern corner of the state, probably near Fargo, I would expect there to be a tornado threat there as well. With the potential for strong tornadoes, let's take a couple of forecast soundings. We'll take one up here by Grand Forks, where the best moisture is, and then another one down by Fargo, and then we'll take one down into South Dakota. So here's Grand Forks. Again, large instability, 4,300 joules per kilogram of mixed layer CAPE here. And one thing to note is we have lots of low-level instability. 0 to 3 Cape here is at 130. So what that does is it's going to be able to stretch those horizontal convective rolls into the vertical very efficiently, and perhaps enhance the tornadogenesis process. We do have very good photographs here, lots of turning in the low levels, effective inflow layer helicity, 224. That is more than adequate for supercells with 0 to 1 helicity of 196. Definitely could see a tornado threat there, up there as far north as Grand Forks. Down by Fargo, again, you see that evidence of spreads becoming a little bit greater down here, 91 over 69 down by Fargo, but very favorable photograph as well. Lots of turning in the low levels, and that about 20-degree spread, I think is about our limit, but definitely within the range for tornadic activity here in the northern plains especially. And then as you go farther south into South Dakota, the spreads get a little bit higher. Still a favorable photograph here with turning in the low levels. So with large Cape in play, large low-level instability in play, I would expect there to be a tornado threat today with any storms that remain discrete, and I think a discrete mode is going to be favored. Let's take a look at our initiating boundary here for our storm mode concerns. Here's our sort of dry line here from North Dakota down into South Dakota. It's a little bit northeast to southwest. Again, looking at this NAM depiction of it, it kinks a little bit more toward the north here as you go into Canada and northern North Dakota. But so we'll say kind of northeast to southwest orientation there, and we'll look at our bulk shear vectors to kind of get a prog for our storm motion. And it does maybe follow that a little bit. It's a little bit more parallel to that boundary, so that would give some credit to the more linear mode. So I think we do have competing influences today as far as storm mode goes. The forcing is a little bit more subtle, which would tend to produce less storms. However, the orientation of the shear vectors as related to the boundary, the initiating boundary, will be a little bit more parallel than what we'd like to see. With northern extent into northern North Dakota, based on this depiction, I would think there would be a little bit more of a window for discrete storms, maybe up by Grand Forks and areas north. If we can get storms to go up there, I think a discrete mode would be definitely a little bit more favored up there because you have a little bit more orthogonal shear vectors to your initiating boundary, if this depiction is correct. Let's take a look at the RAP model. We'll just take a look, get another voice, another opinion in here from a different model. This is the RAP model showing again the same kind of thing, broad southwesterly flow over the northern plains with subtle forcing. We'll look for any short waves here, and just not a whole lot to come by. There could be one right in here encroaching on South Dakota as the afternoon progresses. There's a little bit of a kink in the flow here with that broad belt of 50 knot southwesterly 700 flow. So I'm seeing again kind of the same signals here on the RAP model. Low-level jet kind of in the same spot as the NAM was showing, with a definite increase after dark, especially with southern extent. So that could be something to watch as temperatures cool down there, spreads get a little bit lower. If storms are still discrete down there in South Dakota, definitely could see a tornado threat ramp up after dark or right at sunset. And then the moisture, pretty much the same. We can take a look at a few soundings here from the RAP. A little bit, not quite as gung-ho on the moisture here, a little bit less of 70s dew points up here. We'll take one up here by Grand Forks, down by just west of Fargo, and then down in South Dakota. Much less favorable with the moisture down here. Only low 60s dew points in eastern South Dakota. Is that correct? I don't know. Photograph's not quite as good down here on the RAP as well. But I'll be honest, I'm not a fan of the RAP. The RAP has steered me wrong on many an occasion. So as far as the broad synoptic pattern goes, the overall synoptic pattern goes, I think we have definitely a favorable setup for tornadoes, and I don't really see that low of moisture coming to fruition, especially since we still have we have 7 of these dew points pooled in eastern South Dakota, southwest Minnesota. So I would think those would be able to stream up and kind of maintain themselves throughout the day. So wrap model, moisture-wise, at least I think we can throw that one out. Let's look at some cams. We'll look at the HRRR run first here. This is we'll go to the 12Z run. We'll zoom in on our Northern Plains sector and go to our reflectivity. So here is the depiction. It does have this kind of warm advection region of showers here in eastern South Dakota, so that it's initialized fairly well. And let me put it on forecast loop here. Those continue and dissipate throughout the morning, leaving us with pretty much clear skies across the target area throughout the day. So heating should not be an issue today at all. We get storms to fire about 22Z just west of Grand Forks and into northwest Minnesota, with some storms down here in southern South Dakota and some supercells already coming out of southeast Montana into southwest North Dakota. And then we get kind of a broken line of supercells to fire all the way up from basically the Canadian border down through eastern North Dakota into south central South Dakota. And again, that kind of maintains itself throughout the afternoon hours. Again, I don't know if I buy this many storms forming. With subtle forcing, I just don't see that many storms forming. I think we'll have a more scattered line of storms here, and storms will be able to stay discrete for longer. I just don't see there being this much coverage of storms. And we see we have supercells all the way from the Minnesota-Canadian border, continuing here at 1Z, so 8 p.m. Central Time, with supercells down all the way into southern South Dakota. Again, if any of these are any of these stay discrete, there will be a tornado threat, and a significant tornado threat at that, with 4,000 to 5,000 joules per kilogram of CAPE and more than adequate storm relative helicity for tornadoes. Then it kind of gets messy as the night goes on. They do eventually kind of congeal as they go into Minnesota. Let's look at the HRRR V4 from 12Z. Again, warm advection showers here in eastern South Dakota. Those dissipate throughout the morning. And we get storms to fire about, again, 22Z west of Grand Forks, a little bit farther west here in this depiction, but still kind of in the same general area. Then we get a broken line to form from North Dakota down into South Dakota. And then this lines out a little bit quicker, which again, I just don't see that happening. I do think there's going to be at least a 2 to 3, maybe even 4-hour window for discrete storms today, just given the subtle nature of the flow. But any storms that do form will eventually congeal into an MCS, given the flow parallel to the initiating boundary, and that MCS moves off into Minnesota overnight. Let's see. Let's look at the NAM nest here. The NAM nest sucks as far as the model goes, but it's just another depiction, another guess at what the atmosphere is going to look, what the radar is going to look like later on. And we see storm initiation right around Grand Forks, about 22Z, with storms down here in central South Dakota, same time. And then we kind of get a broken line, and then we get MCS development later on by about 2Z there. Let's see, are the WRFs in? The WRFs are in, so we'll look at the ARW here first. And kind of more of the same, broken line of storms by about 22Z, so models are kind of hinting at 22Z being kind of the initiation time, between 21 and 22Z, or 4 and 5 p.m. Central Time, Central Daylight Time. And then we get kind of MCS formation there by just before sunset up here. NSSL WRF, probably going to show much of the same. This shows actually a storm by about 20Z just north of the Grand Forks area. That's the only model that's shown that so far, so the validity of that is in question, I think. But a broken line of storms fire by about 22Z, and then they eventually congeal into an MCS overnight. So kind of the same picture across all the convective allowing models here, and that kind of matches up with what we're thinking. Storms should fire by late afternoon here across eastern North Dakota, into central South Dakota. They'll be discrete for a couple hours at least, with the subtle nature of the flow, but then they will probably eventually congeal into an MCS overnight, given the boundary parallel flow. One last thing we can look at is the significant tornado ingredients, and on the SREF, and seeing a signal there up in eastern North Dakota. Maximize there, eastern North Dakota between Fargo and Grand Forks going into western Minnesota by 0Z. So everything's kind of pinging on the Grand Forks area, Grand Forks Fargo area, as far as I'm concerned. A little bit better spreads up there. So we could see a slightly enhanced tornado threat up there as well. But definitely see a threat extending down into South Dakota, central and southern South Dakota. Again, we have a 10 hashed area there. That makes sense to me given the parameter space. Very large cape with more than adequate low-level shear for tornadoes to happen with any discrete supercells. Hail threat, I think, will be definitely there as well. Significant hail. Would not be surprised to see several significant hail reports in that region of the 30 hatched area. And then once the storms congeal into a squall line, definitely could see a significant wind threat with the MCS overnight. So that's all I've got for this morning. It's a good-looking setup, I think. One of the better-looking setups we've seen this spring. So if you're out chasing today, good luck. Hope to see you under the mezzo, and thank you for watching. We'll catch you next time.